Hi, welcome to the Footnotes podcast, episode 10. Wow, it's an anniversary. It's our
Three?
10th podcast.
Is it 10?
Yeah, it's 10.
Last week was
Last week was 9. Um, so we've been at this for over 2 months now.
10. Happy 10 anniversary.
Yay. We better make it a special one.
Wow.
Looking at our topics, I see that it's going to be quite special, for sure.
Special.
A lot of things going on there. So why don't we get started? What's
Okay.
new with you, dude?
Um, I I get asked this question by you every week. And every week I'm like, I don't remember what happened in the past week.
Nice.
Um, it's a blur.
Mm.
School, studying for tutorial. But I guess there have been some new developments in my life.
Ooh, developments. I like the sound of that.
Developments, right? So one of my goals coming into this year was to experiment a little more with my psyche or different conditions of the psyche, let's say.
Okay.
So one thing I did yesterday at home was um, prepare to make edibles like marijuana.
Mm.
So we got we prepared canna butter, which is butter infused with cannabis. Like you can make it at home. I tried a spoonful, and it was a very, very weird experience.
That seems like a lot to take in at once.
Yeah, and probably not the best idea because I didn't know the exact dosage.
Okay.
But I think I won't go into too much detail because I don't really remember the details from the experiences too well.
Uh-huh.
But one of the things that it did get me thinking about was um, the idea of like catastrophe or apocalypse, like something that's impending,
Mm-hmm.
and that the idea that somehow the current way of doing things is insufficient in like avoiding catastrophes. And like the reason that has been on my mind was because I saw people on social media sharing articles about there's a new UN report on climate change.
Right.
Um,
I've seen that too.
right. And while I think some like journalistic sources may put more of a catastrophic spin on it, I think the general idea is still that most prominent climate science researchers and the various models they use, the predictions of that like vary, but still agree on the core idea that like current human activity is going to lead us to um, probably greater than 1.5 degrees Celsius of um, climate
Mm.
change. And that can have very catastrophic consequences on things like weather patterns and like agriculture, coastal living, ecosystems. Um, and we can't fully comprehend or predict the scope or scale of the changes that are coming. Um, but yeah, we might know the exact nature of those things. And us living in a like very safe and very well off part of the world in Canada, that's not near any coastal bodies of water, we might not be that much affected by it. But I think there are big changes coming because of that, and not only because of that. I've been thinking about it like some other different ways in which the dominant way of living today is sort of maladaptive or um, is has been misguided in some sense. So I've been experimenting with my diet since the end of the summer with the ketogenic diet, like as I've discussed. And I think, and one interesting thing that we're learning about in class, like this week, is we're studying ischemic heart disease,
Mm-hmm.
Which is now globally the number one killer, like of any disease. So like the metabolic conditions associated with like heart disease, diabetes, obesity, like these are the biggest epidemics of like the Western world and other developing countries who are adopting the Western diet and the Western industrial process.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be a consequence of like the influx of, you know, refined and highly refined processed carbohydrates for the most part. But so I think there are major changes needed in terms of diet and the way we live our lives. Another big, I think, pressing problem in the day and age is like a lack of social connection, a lot of social isolation, and the space for mental health problems to develop. And I think, yeah, none of these are being addressed at like a core level of like what our bodies are adapted for and how we should meet those needs. So like those are like just a big laundry basket of like human existential concerns for the 21st century. And I think it can get quite overwhelming, which may like explain some of the catastrophic apocalyptic tones of my edible experience last night. But those have been kind of those kind of thoughts have been precipitating in my mind, and I get the sense that we need a major, some kind of transformation of our, yeah, of the way we live and think.
Mm. Yeah, that's that's a tough problem, June. Um, thanks for bringing up one of the greatest challenges of mankind. Um, well, it only gets worse too, right? Like the longer we wait, the worse it gets because we get number one, we get so ingrained in this style of living that we become um, more used to it, and it's harder to change. But also, we're using more resources, we're demanding more from the environment and the planet, and so things are just getting worse. Um, one of the things that popped up to my in my mind when you talked about like changing mindset is I think it's a lot easier for us, like you and I, to be thinking about these things and thinking about ways to enact strategies to improve the way we live and become more sustainable. And of course, the classic counter argument is, okay, well, what about the economy, or what about um, the little things that people worry about day to day that make it difficult for them to worry about these bigger ideas, these bigger picture problems. So, for example, let's say a single mother who's trying to take care of her child and raise them, and she's not going to worry too much about trying to get the most nutritious food if she's, for example, not employed, unemployed, or very very busy with her work and unable to spend time with their child and cook for their child. She's going to go and buy the most convenient and cheapest foods, and oftentimes those are the ones that are very well harmful for the child, but and also the environment. So like getting McDonald's for the child every meal, that sort of idea. So it's complicated because the problem is at a grand scale, but we can't get to addressing that grand scale problem until we address the little scale problems. And so I think this is an idea that you're a fan of as well in complexity theory. If each individual piece, if each individual person in this society were to act their best uh, in in the domain that they're responsible for, so themselves or their close family members or close social networks, if they take responsibility for those small areas, then we can have this emergent sort of process whereby those small things build up to eventually solving the global problems. So I think one challenge that people have, especially with research in these global scale problems, is they always demand sort of this global scale change. And like each of us reads this and we're like, we can't do anything about this. Like this is such a big problem. Like how can any individual, how can any one of us do anything to solve this problem? I think what we need to do is start to localize this sort of research and also localize the actions that we need to take. So yes, we know global warming is a thing, well, most of us, and we know it's going to impact us on a grand scale. But why isn't our local government telling us about this? Why are our mayors not bringing this to our attention more frequently? Why are not our educators and people in our close social circles also talking about this? So I think the challenge is to get to that localized level so that we can actually start to, chip away at this huge problem that we have.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree on the need for action at the local scale and at the level of individuals, because I think, in the end, what is going to determine the trajectory of these like larger global systems or local systems that, you know, the effect of human activity on the environment, these are going to be changed only by the behavior change of individuals who exist at various levels of influence. So like I don't disagree with that. I think the idea of like local action and engagement with local politics like runs into another problem, right? So I think a lot of our people our age, like university bubble, highly educated, have a pretty good grasp or consensus of the problem of climate change. And we have maybe enough faith in our institutions of science such that we can reasonably conclude, yeah, this is a very important global problem, and we need our politicians to step up and be accountable for that. But I think there's also an equally large, let's say, an equally large backlash, or people call it climate change denialism, or things like that. Or it may be that local politicians, often left-leaning, who are in support of policies that try to mitigate the effects of climate change, they don't have such a good reputation among other communities or among different voter pools. So like when you try to solve one problem, like you immediately run into another. And that's very frustrating, I imagine. And I think the solution to one problem, like when we try to isolate and solve for one problem, we inevitably run into that wall of like other problems and other considerations that we haven't fully taken into account. And I don't know exactly the way around it, but I do think that when you look at the broad spectrum of problems that, let's say, that plague us today, maybe we can see an underlying pattern or something underlying that can address these problems simultaneously. And I like one of the things I've been thinking about is that maybe like a transformation in how people view consciousness, or like the value of their own lives, the value of other people's lives, like maybe that is like the fundamental problem that needs to be solved if all the other problems have a chance of being, let's say, solved together.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Can we try to better define that? So when you say the psyche, so you're focusing on the psyche. What do you mean by that?
yeah, the psyche, or like I said, consciousness. So
Consciousness, right?
I mean, I think where I can start from is, so like a one book that I've been like very influenced by is like The Systems View of Life, the book about complexity science by Friedhof Capra. And I've described this to you before in that like we have a major paradigm or a major story that we tell ourselves, that we tell each other, that the media and like government, just everyone like retells and shares, that we kind of adopt and accept about how the world is. So that dominant myth for the past, let's say, 500 years in the Western world has been the myth of something like materialism or scientific reductionism. And the core of that story is something like the universe is composed of, the universe operates according to precise and exact mathematical laws. So to a very large extent, we can control and manipulate like nature and other people if we understand those laws. So the universe is kind of like a meaningless mechanical clockwork that just operates according to those principles, and
Right.
that's kind of all there is to it. There's nothing else going on here,
Mm-hmm.
and we've discussed before the idea that that kind of materialism, that dominant story, has been such a powerful driving force, like in our economies, like the scientific revolution directly led to the industrial revolution, and the the civilization, the society that we live in today, is a consequence of us kind of living out that story. And another way to conceptualize story is like the way our psyches construe what the world or universe is actually like, right? So, or like I can also conceptualize it as an operating system. So I think we're coming to something like the logical conclusion of this model or story of what the world is like. It's something like, yeah, living things are just like machines, mechanical systems. We work and live optimally in these kind of neatly atomic individual packaged units that are repeating, like much like a machine. Like we see this structure in our suburbs, uh, and like in our buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Like so, you see this mental paradigm or story repeated over and over again. Um, and I think we're coming to its limits as we've been living this story out for the past few hundred years. And now we're coming to the realization that like this story or mental model of how we thought the world worked is vastly insufficient. And I think with some of the discoveries in like modern quantum physics, for example, or like other disciplines in complexity science, like we think we're coming to a realization that this, first of all, that this mental model is insufficient and cannot account for the kind of different data and new branches of thinking that are coming out, and that secondly, if we continue to live out this, let's say, outdated story, the outcome is going to be like catastrophic failure. Because if we live in a way that's not in concordance with like how reality is actually structured, If we try to impose a different story onto that, then we kind of fail and die. So like one of the, like, let's say, one of the implications of the mechanical worldview is that nature is a resource that can be exploited and manipulated and used, you know, ad nauseum. And we've done that and lived that out. And we're going to have to pay the consequences for that outdated operating system. And I think there's a lot of other characteristics about this operating system that like aren't particularly good for us. So one thing about like materialism is the obsession about, let's say, like money and material goods. And I think the common cultural narrative that's been generated by the media and like corporations who produce and sell material goods is that like those are the ways to a happy and fulfilling life, that the accumulation of material goods and the use of money and economic development, like and just unending growth is the, you know, proper way to, you know, grow corporations or to live your own life. So I think there's a lot of dysfunctional things about this common myth that are very lacking. And so when I say transformation in consciousness, it's something like we need to really think about and update the story that we're living, the story, the mental model about like how the world works, what the function of our like consciousness is within it, and like it's it's like you kind of need to rethink everything. It's like yeah, so it's like we're living in this kind of very tyrannical, let's say, system of thinking or thought. You can think of this as when like the Jews are captured in Egypt, and you need some kind of transformation or you know, just usually crossing of a river is very often symbolic of kind of a death and renewal, like a kind of big transformation and epochs. So, or like a irreversible decision, like when Caesar crosses the Rubicon to invade Rome with his troops, or when Moses crosses the Red Sea with the Israelites. So like you have that kind of transformative process and you hope that things get better, but but the thing is, once you're out of an old story and into something else, you're in a desert. Like you don't know where to go from here. It's so uncertain. I mean, like that was a long rant, but if I could try to condense it, I think there are a web of interconnected issues that's been produced by like a level of cognition that is insufficient to solve the problems at its own level of cognition, right? I think Einstein said this, that you cannot solve problems from like the layer of cognition, level of cognition they were generated in. So like it requires a new perspective or a new like paradigm in order to solve these like older problems. So I think what I'm advocating for is to one thing is that we need ways to something like let people see and discover for their own that the dominant cultural narrative is dysfunctional, and let's say in some ways dysfunctional. And I think there is like a growing awareness of that both on the left and the right, and the need for radical change. I think that's like fairly evident. So it's like taking the red pill, or is it the blue pill? I don't know. something that allows people to see that the world that they're living in, that they're normal, isn't as normal as it seems. Something to like break the bubble, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing is like once that bubble is broken, you need an accurate, comprehensive mental model, paradigm, story, orienting system that is better than what it replaces. Because if it's not better, then people who, let's say, people who like traditional beliefs in, you know, in God or government or institutions, people for whose faith is shattered, they have nowhere to turn other than like tribalism or even worse modes of thinking and operating in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a great need for something like a updated operating system for human beings.
Hmm. So, um, it sounds like in my vocabulary, I guess it would be something like we're not prioritizing the right things, or we're we're focused on the wrong things, and it's because of our culture, um, and the things that society values right now is I think you're saying it's just wrong, like it's not compatible with long-term prosperity, like it's gonna send us to hell, um, and that's the issue, and I agree with you. And I also want to pose the counter argument, of course, that there's some things that are going right,
Yeah.
and you know this, and like I think you agree with me on this. Like the fact that we are even having a conversation about this, I think, indicates already that something is going well. There's far worse societies in which, we couldn't have this conversation. We'd be sent to the gulags, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
um, and censored. Um, so I think there's some work to be done in terms of deciding, okay, what parts of what we're doing right now actually work, and what are components of the operating system that we need to keep, right? So we definitely need a motherboard. It might look like a different motherboard, but we're going to need a motherboard. We need a CPU. We need a graphics card, um, but we need to update them, of course. And I think this isn't actually a new issue. I want to argue that this has been a reoccurring for years and years and years, because, as you say, there's always an apocalypse that happens, and there's always conflict, or there's between people, or between people and Earth, like, and Mother Nature, or whatever, man versus nature, man versus man, that sort of idea. There's always conflicts going on, and whenever we arise from those conflicts, there's these changes. So perhaps one of the things we could focus on is making sure that that conflict doesn't end us, and it doesn't end in the deaths of many, many, many people, if possible. Perhaps that's the only way. I don't know, but it would be nice to reduce the negative impacts of whatever that revitalization, that changing of operating systems is. Um, so I want to stick to this point a bit, because I have this conflict too now, that there's all these ideas that I think are great, and it always comes down to the details where we don't really know what to do, right? We're sitting here, we're talking about how things fail, and how a lot of things that we do right now are unsustainable, but we don't know how to go about enacting change, and that's where my pragmatic side comes in all the time. So I don't know if we have the necessary information to talk about it now, but I would be very much interested in maybe taking like one topic at a time, one issue. Maybe every week we come back with some data, with some information, and some thoughts of how we can improve that small thing. Because I think this is one way that we introduce those transformations in consciousness. I'm a big fan of the idea of championship, where there's few people in a society of thousands that actually run the society and decide basically how people think. They decide the culture, because that culture is somehow adaptable and is also acceptable by the members of the society. We just have to find out what that idea is. And that's a tough job, but that's a job that someone has to take. So I'm not saying that we have to be those people. There's always going to be those people, but I think it's a good step to take to try and accomplish that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree that this is a reoccurring theme in history, or just yeah, just human history and human life. We
Mm-hmm.
develop, let's say, a model, a story, a mythology, or anything about how the world works, you know, what this is all about, how to organize ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and at some point it comes falling apart, whether it's environmental factors or the system's own insufficiencies, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a complex business, but the whole cycle continues. And it seems to me like we're at the epoch of one cycle. We're due for a major OS update. We've had lots of like 0.1 beta alpha updates,
Right.
but now we're like going to a new number. Um, and I do agree that if we're not willing to make like smaller transformations, and let go of some of the ways that we're doing things on a local level, um, like the accumulation of that can lead to like major conflicts in which it's not only the few ideas that some people hold die off, it's that people actually die off.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't want to be in that place ever again after um, we've only heard, but what's happened in the 20th century, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so I think the path forward is something like reimagining different parts of our own lives, of what we have influence over, and that's a tough process. But I think there are some fundamental things that are worth like really digging into more. I think food is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think food and the kind of so I started reading a book or listening to an audiobook called The Story of Our Body. And it's by Daniel Lieberman. He's a evolutionary biologist anthropologist at Harvard. So I think it's one thing that's really important to understand is what our bodies are adapted to, and in what kind of diets facilitate optimal health or like levels of exercise, and how we can like create a food system that supports that.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been exposed to a lot of that kind of thinking while working at the community food center. I have a friend who's doing a PhD right now on sustainable food systems, and I want to get to read his master's thesis on like different food system solutions that these people are figuring out. So I think there are a lot of different cool thinkers who are reimagining these aspects of our lives and how they might change into the future. So I think part of the solution is like trying different things for ourselves, but also maybe connecting with them and seeing what their kind of solutions are like, um, and what they have to say about their particular area or set of areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's definitely a communal effort, right? And that's something I think we're still working with in this day and age. Perhaps is the idea that one person necessarily can't do it. I value championship, but I think as the population grows and the size at which we deal with these problems grows and the size of the problems themselves grow, we're going to need maybe like groups of champions, right? Who all advocate for the same thing, but have knowledge bases in different areas so that they can support each other. and work together. I want to go back to a previous point about the challenge of doing this. And one thing I wanted to talk about this week was something called Stoicism. And the reason why I think this links in is because it's very tough to work through these ideas and not be exhausted and demoralized. And um, I've found that recently with medical school in particular, because there's so much information that I have to take in, and there's so many things that are going on, that it's hard to sometimes to take a moment for myself and reorient myself and make sure that I'm stable and that I'm well. Um, and I think so. There's some practices in Stoicism which basically involve you um, not worrying about the things you can't change and worrying about the things you can change, or at least like putting your attention towards the thing you can change. I think those are the kinds of ideas that really anyone can adopt, and that everyone should adopt, I would even say, and that it would help us to move in this direction of figuring out the best solutions for the problems that we have. And the reason why I say this is because on an individual level, we have a lot of challenges, a lot of needs, a lot of worries, a lot of insecurities all the time, and they get in the way of us being able to actually think about these higher order problems. When we don't have food, for example, or when we don't have the necessary social contact that we need, we don't have good support groups and things like that. Things get so challenging. So I think mixing in a bit of Stoic values or Stoic philosophy in the way that we live will help us to temper a lot of the challenges that we have when facing such a problem by ourselves on an individual level. Yeah, so I've been working with that this week, and I've noticed I'm meditating, but I'm not doing it like I'm not doing it artificially anymore. I actually feel the need to meditate and to take that time to recollect. Before I used to do it, just out of habit, just to see if I could do it. But now it's a necessity, and it's been helping me a lot. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, no, I think that ties in really well with our discussion last week about how we direct our attention and consciousness can have a real impact on like our psyche and our local individual issues, especially like ones to do with emotions and like association, the tangle of associations that we have. So, I'm now like coming to value the practice of meditation and the many different forms that it comes in, and being aware of your own intention and how to direct it. I think is going to be a big component in kind of the change, the transformation of consciousness I talked about. So I do see a role, and what you said about those kind of local problems kind of blocking you from contending with those higher order problems, I definitely agree with that. And to extend that even farther, I think something that I've been kind of thinking about as an idea is that I think the best way that I can contribute to the world is by like really fixing my own problems and like optimally pursuing like what I find curious or what I'm drawn to, right? And I think that logically makes sense. The best that you can be to yourself and to others in your environment, the more that you're going to be able to hopefully influence the world and yourself in positive ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you're pursuing what you're most passionate about or what you're most curious about or drawn to, I think that is the way by which like you generate maximal like potential. You draw the most out of your potential, and in doing so, you draw the most out of the potential of the world or of the environment that you live in to make it better or to to brighten it up a little bit.
Right.
So, I don't think the way we treat our personal problems should be divorced from like those kind of outer environmental problems. Because I think one of the main ideas of like from the systems view of life is that another artifact of the materialistic way of thinking is that we think we're completely separate entities and that we're discrete objects that aren't connected in like an intimate way. But I think an ecological perspective on things is that like there is somewhat of a boundary, but there's no real boundary between where you end and the environment starts.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a constantly like co-creating and co-evolving process. So the moment that like you experience a transformation, the environment around you also will transform in some way. And like the most local example of that might be like a new mindset or kind of micro story that you adopt might change the way your room looks. Like it might get cleaner. And in similar ways, like the way you change yourself, because you're intimately tied to the environment, like it changes the environment as well and like the people around you. So I do think that like this, there's a big conflict between like individualism and collectivism, right? Between
Mm-hmm.
like what should be the focus? Should we focus on individuals or should we focus on like how to like organize a large mass of individuals? And I think that's the fundamental conflict between like um, individualism and collectivism. But like again, I think that like artificial separation comes from like a and or binary logic system of thinking that's been heavily espoused by the like mechanical worldview. Instead, I think what's more helpful is the uh, what is it? Is it the either or? Can you help me out here? I'm like the so there's and or thinking. There's like the binary thinking, and there's
Mm-hmm.
another branch of thinking.
Well, wouldn't
Well,
wait.
it's like either or logic is
Either or
the one we're adopting, but the one that is most adequate and correct according to like the recent ecological developments is the either or both and
both and.
both and so things can be both. You can be both radically individualistic and collectivistic.
Uh-huh. I see.
Because there's no real separation. It's like two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
So to like artificially separate those into two like modes of being is inaccurate. It's like a synthesis of those two things would be something like if you act in a way that brings out your like own individual like person and desires, but you do so in like a somewhat socially constricted way, and you move forwards, that's going to produce the best outcome for you and the
Mm-hmm.
the collective. So that's why it's and that's how like complex adaptive systems organize. They don't organize based on like a top-down hierarchical just one overseeing person organizing everything. It arises as a result of the interactions of individual autonomous members forming relationships and interacting with one another. So I think I'm making the case for a kind of individualism, but that doesn't mean it has to be incommensurate with like, collectivist ideals or ideas.
Right. Okay.
So I think like the approach to fix your own problems and to focus on you is like the best way I know of going towards that,
Mm-hmm.
towards the promised land.
And it's very self-sufficient, right? Like it's self-sustaining because you're not going to burn out if you're taking care of yourself. Um, and hopefully, so the idea is that hopefully it will bleed out and end up helping the greater picture and the people around you and things like that. So I think the greatest skepticism that I have about that idea is, okay, well, when does it get to a point where it actually helps other people and that it helps the greater picture? And how do we measure that? That's one of the greatest, the biggest skepticisms, I can't even speak anymore, that I have so far. Um, because I think there comes a point where you need to take active effort to say, okay, well, I'm not just going to worry about my problems, and I'm going to branch out and start to worry about the problems of others, and I'm going to start worrying about the problems of the collective. And maybe the argument could be made that, okay, those problems become your problem and you internalize them. But I'm not satisfied with that answer. Maybe there is sort of this idea that everyone's problem is your problem and that your problems is everyone's problem. There's just problems. There are just problems out there. And depending on what you decide to focus on, um, your actions will be different. Um, so in that case, I think it becomes a matter of priority. So I think maybe this is compatible with your idea. Let me know what you think, but you should prioritize yourself because that's what's going to keep you sustained for sure. And once you've prioritized yourself enough, you can start prioritizing the problems of others. And that movement is active and it's conscious. It's not just staying at the point of helping yourself. It's not just looking after your room and what's around you. You have to take an active step to move towards solving these external, let's say, or maybe not to make that distinction, these other problems that are a bit further away. I don't think it's as natural as saying, okay, I'm going to start, or I'm only going to focus on what's affecting me directly. Does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. I think at some point you do make that conscious effort to help others, or to live in service for something else, for
Mm-hmm.
something like a greater cause. Um, but the thing is, I think that greater cause that you identify has to be synergistic with the kind of person you are,
Mm-hmm.
and like your temperament, your personality, what you're good at, what kind of environment you thrive in, right? So if those things don't like map on well to each other, then there's going to be a failure. So you have to be both, like you have to be able to like kind of juggle both things, like you need to be both like radically individualistic, because like you are your body, and like your ability to operate in the world is like dependent on your health.
Mm-hmm.
But you also need to be like radically collectivistic and say, like, have this thought experiment, like you brought up, like, what if like everyone else's problems were actually like my own problem? And I think there's a lot of different ways to think about that. And like one way would be like a selfish way to think about that might be like, well, problems that other people have are probably going to like spill into my life, or like they're not doing well might affect me in some negative way. So that's one reason to be interested. Another might be just like altruistic, and like I can empathize with their struggles and pains, so I should help them. Another thing, like I've come across this idea in like some Eastern texts, like some, and the idea is that like it's something like your all consciousnesses are from one source, and you're actually the kind of thing that's lived through all lives. And so another person's suffering is your suffering. And if you start to live in a way that's corresponding to that, then the world will get better. Like that, that's like a very deep, like metaphysical idea that I've like come across. But there's like various layers of interpretation, to this idea that you should like take others, someone else's suffering as your own, and that should compel you to act. So I like those are two very drastically different ends of the poles, right? Like you have this need for self-preservation and survival, but you also have this impulse um, to do good to others and to reduce suffering in the world in some way. Um, so like the juggle between that is like very difficult, and it's a paradox. It's a paradox, but I think they are. I think they can be resolved when we align our own motivations and self-interest with the the interest of others. When um, we align our capacity to help others with the things that we're interested in and genuinely curious about.
And like maybe as a final point, I think there's something to be said about the complexity of those self-interests, because to be aligned with so many other people is, I think, immensely difficult. I think there's so much heterogeneity in people and what they value, that there's always going to be some hiccups between what you think is important and what you think is valuable and what other people think is important and valuable as well. And so I think if we want to act in a way that impacts the lives of the most amount of people in a positive way, is to develop complexity within ourselves and to decide, okay, I have these several self-interests. It's not just one or two. There's maybe millions and millions. And at different points in my life, I'm going to decide some are more important than others. And that will be influenced by the people around me and the people that I'm working with. Because, depending on your situation and your circumstance and your environment, there are some things you can worry about and some things you can't. And that will be influenced by the interaction you have with other people. And so I think, so the idea that I'm trying to get at is, maybe it's not just about deciding for yourself what is important to you and what is best for your self-interest. It's also looking around and saying, okay, well, what can I compromise? What is the best way to reconcile the things that I'm devoted to or that I'm invested in with those around me?
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think that is a better um, reconciliation between the individualism and the collectivism idea. It's, I have these cards I want to play, but some of them I can't. I just can't play them. It's not the right moment, so I'll pick and choose depending on the situation.
Mm-hmm. I mean that made me think about, so like there's this idea of social constraints and the responsibilities you have in whatever role you play right now. So right now we're relatively free of them. Well, I mean, being medical students is a pretty big responsibility and use of our time. So, you know, to be fair, no, we do have a lot of constraints. But imagine if you had like children and a family. Um, I can't have like a wife and two young kids and say like, guys, daddy wants to go explore like Tibet. I'm gonna go like be a monk and meditate for like 5 years. Peace out, right? Like there are some solutions that are clearly more incompatible with your situation, and so I think that it's a grind. It's like that constant negotiation process between like what you want and what you think would be good with the world, with what other people believe. But I think you mentioned a lot about like heterogeneity, but my guess is that at some deeper levels, I think people generally have some kind of agreement with for most basic things, as the most fundamental things like the value of a human life. Although like that is being contentious, or that
Right.
some of those ideas are more contentious and there is variation on that theme, but I'm like very scared, but also very optimistic, because like, yeah, it is a difficult process of negotiating values, but if we continue to do it and to put in that work, where we get to is hopefully, well, less terrible than it could be.
Let's say better. um, just to end off on an optimistic note, why not think it's going to be better than it could be?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could be the best, like unimaginably glorious thing ever, or its end, or its complete opposite.
Well, let's hope it's not the opposite. I'm just being wary of the time. Do want to keep these nice and brief to get our ideas in, and we'll have more to talk about next week, I'm sure. I'm sure we're going to keep having this conversation as well, because I think this is one of our core conversations that keeps coming up on a week-to-week basis. So to the listeners, thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week.